All right, so we are recording. Welcome everyone. My name's Abby Miller. I have been training on this topic for goodness, almost 10 years at this point, which is wild. Um, Doing it on behalf of Housing Innovations and the Connecticut Balance of State today with Liz Isaacs, who you all, I'm sure, know and love. So we're here to talk about the equal access rule, HUD's equal access rule, also HUD's policy on involuntary family separation, and then actually a lot of this training is really about like practical approaches to how you create spaces of inclusion. Just thinking about over the years the same issues tend to come up, so making sure that we touch on those. So. Um, We're going to, I'll start out just going through, I like to lay groundwork, but I don't want to assume that anybody on this call knows or doesn't know things. But just so we're all working from a level playing field, set some baseline terminology. And I want to talk about where we are today, and not hide from the risks and vulnerabilities and violence that's being done right now to queer and trans folks. Then I'll move into talking about HUD's equal access rule, the involuntary family separation policy, CT BOS's anti-discrimination policies, and then the remainder of the training, really the second half, is that creating practical approaches to creating spaces of inclusion. So I'm going to use this lovely little gender unicorn to lay a terminology base for us. Because I think, when I started training on this 9-10 years ago, transgender wasn't even really a word that people knew. And I think today, unless it was relevant to you, you had somebody in your life or identify as trans yourself. But today, I think everybody knows the word trans, and because of the way that media has been covering it, and the way that it has been politically weaponized, I think there's a higher awareness, but also it's mixed with a lot of misinformation. So just laying that base. The first thing that I want to distinguish here is that gender and sex are two different things. Sex is a category that is assigned when people are born. Baby comes out, whoever that medical professional is, looks at the baby, just observes, and based on the genitalia they can see, they're going to say, this is female, this is male, or maybe this is an intersex baby. Most of the times, so I want to go into this just a little bit. Sex, sex is being touted right now by a lot of people as something that is immutable, that is absolutely always been female, male. Why are we doing all these other things? Not true, actually. Intersex folks are as common as redheads. Like, think about how many redheads you know. The intersex condition is something that is very common. And what it means is that somebody has differences in their chromosomal makeup and their genitalia makeup, such that it's not necessarily clear, right? Everything is not aligned in a binary fashion. So somebody can have chromosomes that you would indicate female, but genitalia that indicates male, or vice versa. So I just want to blow up sex a little bit because I think it's being touted as something that is always binary, and that simply is not the case and never has been the case. But beyond sex, which is very much related to genitalia, chromosome, makeup, gender is something else entirely, which is something that everybody knows themselves to be. And the reason why sex and gender often seem like the same thing is because for most people, they are the same. So that's what the term cisgender means. If you've heard this or using it, CIS, cis. Cis just means same. It means you are part of the group of people who was born with chromosomes and genitalia and a gender identity that all are in alignment. But there are also a whole group of us out there for which that's not the case. Um, and if we're talking about gender, there's a there is an understanding that each of us have that is much easier to arrive at when the gender and sex are the same, because really you don't have to think about it, right? That medical professional has provided that sex for you when you were born. Um, and then society says, well, if this is your sex, this is your gender. Same. And so for the trans community, we have had to figure out how to pull that apart and pull it apart because in your mind, you know the gender that you are. But then society starts wrapping all this stuff around you from the day that you're born, saying, this is who you are, this is who you are, this is who you are. So um, the process of coming to understand your own gender is a really important process. That is actually the process of transitioning. When I use transition throughout this presentation, I am talking about internal transition, like understanding oneself as your gender, and also the social transition, using different pronouns, telling people what your gender is, like coming out, those concentric circles of coming out, that you only do with people when you feel safe enough to. And I'm also emphasizing transition as personal and social because I think in this moment where we have gender becoming such a weaponized term, the other thing that has happened is this over focus on medical transition. Medical transition is something that not everybody in the trans community is engaged in any way. And even if people are, it can just be hormone therapy. It can be hormone blockers. But there's this laser focus right now on surgery, right? This modification of our bodies. And so today I wanna like breathe some oxygen into the conversation so that we are not so focused on bodies, because bodies do not matter nearly as much as the people, the souls, the brains, the minds, the selves that are coming through our doors. Um, one other area that I'll touch on with this gender unicorn is gender expression. So expression is everything external that other people can see or feel. It can be the way that you speak, the tone, the range of your voice, the haircut, clothing, the way that you walk, the sort of accoutrement that you add to yourself. To tell the world, hey, this is who I am. But gender expression and gender identity are not the same thing, because gender expression is just, it's an adornment. It's a set of choices that you're making about how you present yourself to the world. Gender identity is not a choice. It is an understood part of one's identity. So expression can also be perceived by others as very different than, I may be sitting here. I identify as gender fluid. I am using they, them pronouns at the moment. Sometimes I've used she, they pronouns. And I may be feeling like, hey, I am presenting to you a gender fluid person. But everybody on this call is looking at me and you have your own perception. So that's a really important difference between identity and expression, because identity, I know who I am. You know who you are. And expression is something that can be perceived, but is not nearly as important as what we know ourselves to be. The other area I'll point to, it's less fundamental to this training, but I do want to touch on it, is this physical and emotional attraction. And that is really like a lot of the terms under the LGBTQ plus umbrella are related to sexual orientation, which is about attraction to other people. So gender plays a role there, but it's not at all the same as gender. It's really about who you are looking to emotionally and romantically partner with, be part of other people's lives. Um, okay, so, um, and one thing I should also say, I don't mind being interrupted like out loud as I go. So if you have a question, raise your hand or just come off mute and ask. Doesn't bother me. Or pop it in the chat and Liz can tell me it's there. Um, so with that framework, we are faced with a situation in the US, and I would say globally, but I'm going to talk about US specific, where queer and trans folks are systemically less resourced, more likely to be in poverty, in debt, more likely to be evicted, more likely to be victims of violent crime, more likely to be victimized in a variety of ways. And I have some things here. I'm not going to talk about them specifically. I really want to focus on this slide and the next one, where I think this is the clearest distillation I've seen of what is the impact of being queer or trans in the US. And I think this very simple graph tells a very clear story. The poverty rate is consistently higher for folks who are trans or who have a sexual orientation that is not straight. But when you get into the striation of, okay, well, this is a big umbrella that we're talking about within the LGBTQ plus umbrella. Um, what does it look like? Like, what are the resource levels and the discrimination and the barriers and the access barriers that people have to power and money? And here you can see very clearly trans folks are really systemically much more under-resourced without the access to power, privilege, the things that help us make better lives for ourselves. If you're wondering what the sudden dip from 2020 to 2021 is, those were the ARPA COVID relief bills that brought a lot of people above the federal poverty line. And so you can see, what a drastic impact those had for trans folks in the country. The starkest decrease in poverty. Nonetheless, knowing that we're past that time now and that this no longer looks like this, I think the takeaway here is just understanding that we are going to engage with folks who are trans and or queer, who are systemically at a much lower point of access than other groups. And so that's really that's what we're working with. And this smattering here is, with these headlines, I want to show some of the victimization and attacks that are actually coming from government entities against trans folks specifically. We have attorneys general offices in Texas, in Tennessee, in Virginia that are subpoenaing records just really blatantly to get lists of trans people. Young people who are still in school, minors, people who've been served in hospital systems. And while it has not made headlines, there have also been subpoenas of HMIS systems. And this is a really important point. This isn't fear mongering. This is to say, and I'm going to focus on it in this training about these practical ways to have inclusive space. We are in a moment where safety is of heightened importance, and safety in the form of data privacy. So I will talk about that, but I wanted to set the stage of what is happening. And of course, Connecticut's not necessarily in that situation, right? So you can see here, um, Kim, I see your hand. What's up? No, didn't mean to.
Yes, did. I was trying to get the hand raising, not the clapping, and it kept going. Abby, I just wanted to ask you, could you repeat? You said certain agencies are asking for records of trans youth just because why? Just because they want
Um,
to know?
yes.
Who?
So the Texas Attorney General's office, the Virginia Attorney General's office, in Florida, multiple agencies, in Tennessee. I'm not sure of the office, but they're subpoenaing medical records, and
They're
it's
getting them. They're getting them. It's not protected. They're saying, we want records of everyone you've served who's trans, and they're getting that information.
sometimes they're getting it and sometimes they're not, and that's what
Wow.
we'll talk about today is
Okay.
how we stay on the right side of protecting people in our system.
Okay, thank you. That's
Yeah.
terrifying though, but thank
It's
you.
terrifying. It is terrifying. And I don't want to shy away from the fact that it is terrifying. Um, so you can see on this map, so on the left-hand side, Connecticut is this beautiful blue color, meaning that your state has passed legislation that protects trans folks. What that means in the context of the rest of the country, where you can see everywhere from the black with with the red slices through it to the dark red, the light blue. So the sort of scale here is in Florida, there's actually Equality Florida, which is the LGBTQ advocacy group there, has issued a travel advisory, as long as it may be 2 years now, saying if you're trans, it's not safe to travel to the state. So we are having intra-US migration happening right now, and travel advisories about where you go and where you don't go. Now, what that means for Connecticut, I'm not going to engage in a lot of fortune telling here, but what we do know on the right-hand side um, is that particularly folks with one or more trans people in their household, if they have any means possible, they are moving out of these dark red states, and into states where there are protections. And that is because there are parents of trans kids that can no longer get gender affirming care for those kids, which becomes a massive suicide lethality risk for those kids. There are trans parents who can't get health care, who are having rights more and more restricted based on their identity. So we're in a very odd moment. And I think perhaps not today, perhaps not this year, but as these divisions, if these divisions continue to happen, I would expect that Connecticut would be seeing some level of immigration from other states. So that's like regardless of homelessness, right? We're not even talking about unhoused situations. But once you get into unhoused situations, even then, and this is where our work kicks in. So the context is important. This is work that we influence and we control. So of folks who are unhoused, This is a bit of a confusing graph, but this like pink bar at the bottom is saying, okay, so of all people in the US who are experiencing homelessness, 40% of them are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Okay, that's a really high number. Now let's cut that by gender and look at trans, non-binary, gender questioning individuals. And there is where you start to see, oh my God, okay, we're working from a baseline of 40% of people are outside, but for trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming, gender questioning folks, it is so much higher. And that's the work. That is our work. So I'm gonna, yes, right here. I'm going to play a video, short little clip from here with this lovely human here, Cecilia Gentili. She has been just a godmother of the trans community here in New York City, which is where I'm based. She passed earlier this year, and what she'd been doing the last few years is putting together this group called Trans Equity Consultants, where they talk about what it's like to experience the healthcare system as a trans person. And it has so much value and resonance and overlap for our work that I find the way she describes it is really lovely. So just want to play a little clip of this, and bear with me because I'm going to have to skip forward. Doop, 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 doop. Where are you?
There were mental.
Okay.
And every time I go and see her, she's great, right? But I had to kiss so many frogs, to find this princess,
Apologies, I dipped in. Cecilia is talking about her medical provider, who she loves.
I encounter medical providers that refuse to see me, just like that. Oh, no, I'm not gonna see you. And had, not even made an effort to say, like, to masquerade it with something that, like, I'm not gonna see you because you're trans. I had experiences where doctors try to change me. They, I guess they felt like they had the right to talk me into not being trans. I had experiences where I was asked intrusive questions about my genitalia, about what my plans for my genitalia were, and basically they tried to tell me what to do with my body, when I believe that being trans is actually taking control of your body and not doing what other people want. So I had a lot of terrible experience. I had disrespectful experiences. But a good experience is an experience that is seamless, that is like anybody else. I'm not looking for that experience where like my gender is elevated and like transness and trans flags in the back wall. I'm looking for just an experience. Hi, who are you? What's your problem? This is how you think we can fix this problem. And if it has something to do with my body, let's talk about my body. But if it doesn't, let's not go there. I live with psoriasis, that is a skin disease that happened mostly in my elbows. One time I went to a dermatologist that asked to see my genitals. And I told him, I don't have psoriasis in my genitals. And he said, I just need to check. And it made me feel terrible, borderline violated. And it's not something that will encourage me in the future to seek medical services again, right? Bad experiences, they're not just bad experiences that end when the bad experience ends. You know, bad experiences stay there for a long period of time, and then you make decisions based on those experiences. And for that is that for those bad experiences that I had, you know, is that, you know, many times if I have to go to a doctor, I think twice, and I'm like, oh, maybe this will go away on its own. I don't need to see a doctor. And that's not something that should be, you know, we should all feel comfortable with going to a doctor, right?
All right. Oh,
All
what
right.
have I done? What have I done? Come back. So just gonna let this sit here for a second, but absorbing some of what Cecilia had to say, these same things, I have heard these same stories from trans friends and people who I've worked with in shelters, in warming centers, in our programs. And it's you know, this I'm just gonna say obsession with bodies is leading to people avoiding services, whether it is medical or whether it is social services. So that's that's to set a context for talking about the equal access rule. I think any regulation is, of course, there's a regulation. You have to be compliant with it because it exists and it applies to you, right? If you receive HUD funding, it applies to you. But beyond that, why would we not want to serve people in ways that they feel safe to come inside, to sort out where they are at the moment and get the professional and peer support that they can get from our system. And so that's really the North Star. That's the goal. So to talk about the equal access rule, there were two phases of this rule. The first one HUD put out in 2012, and they started working on it probably in 2010 because these things take a couple years to get out. And what was happening at that time is that you know, we've had the Fair Housing Act for decades and decades, and it has always said that it prohibits sex-based discrimination. But what was not happening at that time is the courts in the country were not consistently ruling that discrimination against trans and queer folks was sex-based discrimination. There was divided opinion, legal opinion, on whether that was sex-based discrimination or not. Since then, we have had the Bostock Supreme Court ruling, which said very clearly, with a majority conservative court, that gender identity and sexual orientation are inextricably linked to sex and therefore are covered under sex-based discrimination. So today, HUD would not have needed to create this rule, right? Because the Fair Housing Enforcement would be there consistently to do that. But at the time, they did need to. And they did so because without the Fair Housing Act, there weren't any teeth to say, hey, you have to serve everybody who needs services. You can't pick and choose based on bias about trans or queer folks. So this initial 2012 rule said very clearly this second statement: equal access is provided in all HUD-assisted programs, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. So that means a couple or a larger family does not need to all be married or blood related, right, to be served as a family. And the regardless of gender identity made sense in all but one very important situation, which a lot of our programs have, which is we have allowed gender segregated services for a long time. In our shelters, in transitional housing, sometimes even in permanent housing. So that was a gap in that 2012 rule. So in 2016, HUD shored up that gap and said, okay, we know we need to come back and look at gender identity in these situations. And so the 2016 rule said, related specifically to gender identity, you have to place and serve individuals in accordance with their gender identity. Now, I've added self-reported here because I want to be clear about this next line and what this means. The rule also prohibits asking intrusive questions or requiring quote unquote proof of gender identity. If you think back to that gender unicorn and what I was talking about there, that identity is a personally held understanding, that somebody may not be able to tell on the outside or may have their own perceptions about who that person is and what their gender is. I think you can start to see then why quote unquote proof, it's not proof. IDs, medical records, birth certificates. These are things that people have been asked for years to prove their gender identity. The problem is we are not working in a legal or medical system that is set up to record gender identity. We are working in a legal and medical system that is set up to record sex assigned at birth. So knowing that those are not the same things, then folks who don't hold the same gender and sex are very unlikely to have documents that have their gender on them. It's difficult to get a driver's license changed or a state ID, even more difficult to get a birth certificate changed. And back to what Cecilia was talking about, her experience, there are many horror stories over the years of people being asked, well, essentially, what's in your pants? And that's how we're gonna decide where you go, because I don't believe you. I don't believe that you are telling me who you are. And I'm gonna need some physical evidence of that. Or saying, well, you haven't transitioned. You haven't had the surgery. There are many gender affirming surgeries. But the surgery that everybody is talking about is genitalia. This is what the focus is. And so this rule is attempting to correct for those behaviors that may not even be coming from a place of malice, just thinking, okay, this is what we need to do. Two other pieces that I want to lift up from this rule. One is that if you are a HUD-funded provider, meaning you take any form of HUD funding, including CDBG, home, right? Not just COC and ESG programs, you have to update your policies and procedures to reflect that you're in compliance with this rule. And if you are taking steps to address privacy concerns, they have to be non-discriminatory steps. I'm going to talk about it later with reasonable accommodations because it's a really it's an important topic to understand how to move through. But those are the main elements of the rule. I'll say one other thing that I don't have on here, but the 2012 rule, and it's actually related to talking about involuntary family separation. The 2012 rule, HUD established for the first time a single definition of family. Prior to that, every program in HUD had a different definition, which is fun. So it established a single one, and it also was a very expansive definition of family that said, you know, you can define who's in your family. Which is very inclusive. In the queer and trans community, the concept of the reality of chosen family is big, because many people have been are estranged or completely rejected by biological families. So chosen family is equally, if not more important, than biological family. So sticking with this family topic, HUD has a policy that is if you serve families with minor children, that's key. If you're serving families with minor children, you cannot pick and choose which family compositions you're going to serve. If there are minor children present, that makes it actually they are in a protected class. So familial status, prohibition on discrimination against familial status at a legislative statute level, is tied to the presence of children in the household. So it's a very strong statutory protection. So that means for our programs, we are prohibited from kicking out boys at age 13 or 14 in a family shelter or in a DV shelter. Cannot turn away a dad with a kid because we only serve moms with kids. You can't turn away a same-sex couple or an opposite-sex couple with kids because that's not the family composition we serve. And all of this is really the big protection is tied to the presence of children in the home. So that's the top line. But also remember this concept of chosen family, and that HUD has this more expansive definition of family. And so if there are multi-generational families with no kids, right? Nobody under 18, or there are non-romantic groups presenting as family, oftentimes young people will be moving in chosen family and need to be served as a family. And those folks are not necessarily getting services as a family. So the absolute like death grip Loctite part of this is if there are children present, you must serve any family composition. But there is a sort of secondary one, which is let's not rip family units apart, even if they don't look like the family units that we have tended to serve. There's a link to an FAQ down here, and I did see a question. Oh, no, not a question. Okay. There's a link to an FAQ in here that HUD put out that explains some of the, nuances and intersections of these. But I'll say HUD's COC program rule says very explicitly that involuntary family separation is prohibited. You can't pull a family apart to serve them. All right. I'm gonna pause here for a second and see if questions have come up from anybody about anything that we've talked about so far. Please don't be shy. So let's talk about CT-BOS policies on anti-discrimination. So all of these, and these should be fairly familiar, right? CT-BOS has had this policy for, Liz, what, 6 years, 7 years, maybe longer? But I'll go through them. Conduct. We cannot change hearts and minds, but we can say, hey, this is a workplace. We're serving people. And no matter your sort of persuasion toward what you think about the people coming through our doors, when you step through as an employee or as a volunteer or as a contractor, we expect your standard of behavior to be welcoming, to be providing the same experience. Like what Cecilia said, a good experience is a seamless one. It doesn't need to look any different for me than it looks for anyone else, but just make it look the same for me. Can we do that? So that's what we're getting at here, right? That people's privacy is honored, respected, and protected. That demographic information, if it needs to be collected, is collected. If it does not need to be collected, it's not. And this is to the intrusiveness, like what do you need to know to serve somebody? And sometimes it's a funder requirement. If it's not a funder requirement, ask yourself very carefully, why am I asking this question? Do I need to know this? That when you are engaging potential or new clients, that you always ask what name you go by, right? Don't just rely on legal name that's on documents, that you ask somebody's pronouns, give somebody your pronouns, ask them their title. And by title, I mean Miss, Mr., Mrs., Mix, MX is gender neutral title. And the main thrust of that is just don't make assumptions, right? About the person in front of you. Just ask. That at intake, if there are gender separated facilities or services, like even wings within the same facility, that you are relying on somebody's self-reported gender to make those placement determinations, and service determinations. Deanna, what's up?
So, just a question on this and kind of looking at privacy and that kind of thing, then, say like in an HMIS intake assessment where I guess why in those programs then are we still asking for gender and collecting it? I'm sure to me, it's always been to look at who we're serving. But then I guess I look at when we run those reports, if we have data not collected or not specified, or they almost ding us for not having the, the information collected. So I guess like, have we looked at that end? And if it's really to kind of, when I guess when I think about, we're talking about agency, government subpoenaing things, and like you said, they subpoenaed HMIS. I'm trying to figure out what is the continued need for us to collect this information to serve our people. Because I don't think that someone going from shelter to shelter or even like housing program to housing program, and maybe we should be doing this, I don't necessarily look at a prior intake and check their gender. So I don't understand, is there any talk about like why we're still collecting that information?
So I will say, HUD is definitely thinking about that. And if they have not already, I can say this with reasonable certainty, that they are decoupling data quality from the gender element, that's not something that they are trying to make as important as some of the other data elements, recognizing that so much of that particular element is about people's sense of safety in the moment and whether they feel like they can, I mean, it's coming out. You are coming out to a stranger in that moment. So I think there's definitely a lot of focus on that right now, and sensitivity to understanding like what do we need and not need. The reason to collect it has been visibility, because visibility has meant if we can show that we are serving folks, then right, we get more attention on it, we can get more protections. In the current moment, visibility is not necessarily correlated with protection. So I would say it is an open question that as a COC is something to grapple with, that HUD is grappling with it as well. And I don't think it's a settled response of whether to collect or not collect. I would say the corollary that I know your COC dealt with in 2016 was to purge from your HMIS any citizenship status related information, for a similar sort of concern. I don't know if things are there yet. I think Connecticut's in a different situation than other states, but I say all that to say I don't think it's a settled I don't think it's a settled question, Deanna. And I think it's something we're gonna be dealing with in the coming years, coming months, maybe. And I will talk more about the confidentiality and privacy a little later, including subpoenas. And to go through these last three of the policies, so there is a no tolerance for harassment, bullying, and violence. That we're looking to uphold the safety of everybody in these programs. That any healthcare provision or referrals that are being made to known gender affirming healthcare referrals, or that if you are doing any level of healthcare in your programming, that it is gender affirming. And for dress code, that you're maintaining gender neutral policies. So rather than talking about what women and men need to be wearing, that you're just talking about people, what people need to cover, or, you know, whatever your dress code looks like, if you have one. Liz, I saw something, did someone pop a question in the chat?
Just that they had the same question that Deanna
Okay.
had. So.
Yeah. I know these are not satisfying. It is a conversation, you know, that we all need to be having. So to start to get into the practices of inclusive spaces, these systems do not happen by accident. The systems that we have now were set up not necessarily intentionally discriminatory or exclusive, but there was a time when queer and trans folks were not really on the radar, as like, hey, we need to actually be careful about how we're serving people to make sure that they feel safe to come in, that they feel safe to speak to us, to access our services. So to build inclusive systems, you've got to start tackling it, and doing it systematically. Where are the weaknesses in your system? Who needs to become more competent and fluent in LGBTQ culture, in understanding how to speak to people? What are actually the sexual and gender minority needs in the COC? Because, you know, this moment of telling somebody your gender is coming out, there's always a suppressed percentage of trans folks in the system because they're not coming out when they, you know, give you responses to the HMIS data elements. So if you don't have reliable information in your HMIS, who do you go to? Who can you work with? Do you have a statewide Pride Center? Do you have a statewide Equality Federation chapter? They may have better data than we do, right, for our system. So looking outside, and acknowledging that LGBTQ people are born everywhere, always, every day. In the US, 36% of LGBTQ folks are in the South. So this is not something where like New York City just breeds queer and trans people. No, we end up in New York City because we don't feel safe in other places, right? So, but people are born everywhere. So recognizing that this is a backyard thing that we all need to be embracing as our community. And figuring out, you know, how to address how to interrupt what's happening now today, while also planning, like getting some long-term plans in place to make the system work better. So if you are sitting there as a provider or, you know, as a CAN lead, and thinking like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. HUD has put out an equal access assessment tool that is pretty good. So the original one was an Excel sheet. It was not great. You could go through it, but it's been hard coded into HUD Exchange, meaning when you sign in, because you also, if you have a HUD Exchange login, then you are associated with an agency and you can take an agency assessment right in there. Now, you can see on the screenshot that I've taken, it's for internal use, that, well, maybe it's not here. Nope, never mind. Their caveat is below this, but it says if we take data out of this, we're only taking aggregate data. This is not a monitoring tool. This is a TA tool for agencies to use for your own edification, improvements, and evaluation of how you're doing. So when you take this assessment, it's weighted so that the most important areas rise to the top. So if you say no to 12 things in this, it is going to pull up the top 3 most important and say, this is your action. These are your actions for the next year or for the next 6 months. And so it really is guided to help you if you're like, I don't know where to start. This is a great place to start. So the remainder of this is all the practical approaches. So in CT BOS's system, you have the CAN intake. You have staff who work at each of those CANs, 211 as well, that when when those folks are engaging with people, they need to know all of these bullets, plus maybe something else. And if folks have ideas about what that is, please put them out there. They need to know which are the really competent programs, which ones are offering gender affirming care, either because they have it in-house or because they have quality healthcare partnerships. Which programs have private or private-ish, I call it, where it's not just like fully open. Adequate staffing for safety and security. If there are programs that have patterns of discriminatory behavior, because regardless of what HUD says, there may still be programs that are saying, nope, we will not serve men with children. We will not serve trans parents with children or parents with trans children. If you know that information and you have it already there, you're not like just plopping it all out for somebody, but as they are trying to navigate where do I go in this system based on my needs and the things that are most important to me, which could be gender affirming care, could not be. It could just be about like, I just need to make sure that there are staff there, like enough staff at night that I can sleep soundly. It could just be like, I need to go to a place where I can get an accommodation to have a private shower. Those may be the most important things to somebody. So not going in with preformed conclusions about what somebody needs, but having the information about the system, and then offering it as people tell you what's important to them. And particularly for folks who do not identify on either binary. So there are, in our beautiful trans community, there are folks who were assigned female at birth who identify as men. There are people who were assigned male at birth who identify as women. There are also lots of people, myself included, who identify in the spectrum, in the gray area of gender. Like, it doesn't feel binary. It's just not. So knowing that there are many people in that non-binary identity status, how do we deal with the binary shelter system that we have, knowing that folks are going to butt up against this? So I'm pulling this out as a specific thing that people need help with at that point of intake and access. And what I think eases the process is leading with your pronouns. letting somebody know, hey, I know gender is not binary. I know that people identify not as just man or just woman. And our system is set up in a binary way for the most part, right? If it's not, if you have a program that is not, fantastic. Give that information. But if you don't hide it, right? Like, this is a moment to be a co-conspirator with that person. How do I walk alongside you to help get you a placement that is going to not disaffirm who you are? And the equal access rule allows for this, because it only ruled that rule is written binary. It's not written with non-binary folks in mind. So what it did do is just say, it's like a single line in the preamble, like, hey, if somebody doesn't identify as a man or a woman solely, ask them what placement is going to make the most sense for them. So we can do this. But this is part of like addressing the now and also the later. It would be great if a year from now, 2 years from now, you could say, hey, we actually do have a gender expansive shelter. So that's the like work with now and the people in front of you, but also be planning out for something different in the future. So after this training, you will get from Liz a sample provider agency level policy document. It's a sample. It is my best stab at each of these areas, knowing that one, you have to be compliant with the equal access rule, and part of being compliant with it is having policies and procedures that demonstrate that you're compliant. So it's a need for providers. And also, this is not an area that everybody's an expert in. So let's get you some starter language, at least, that you can look at, you can change as you want. You can add, you can subtract, whatever makes sense for your particular agency, but it gives you a start. And I will send it in a Word version form, so you can really like do whatever you need with it. Teresa, what's up?
Hi, I have a perspective of having been in the shelter system, and the couple times that I was there, there were LGBTQ people who came in, and always the problem was what you have in the shelters in the emergency situation is you have a lot of people with other traumas, and a lot of it, especially in the women's shelters, can be sexual trauma. And the experiences that I had is that when you're trying to sort of like integrate and make everyone comfortable, it's like almost impossible, because you have sort of like a congregate system. The beds, you're in one room with multiple people, everyone's sharing bathrooms, and you have people. I get to speak just from my individual circumstances. When I went into the shelter, I was unable to speak to men. I was almost nonverbal. I was non-functioning, and the issue always comes down to the consumer level more than the staff, what the staff is willing to do. It was what is possible. It's all, I can't even see a way to make everyone comfortable in the emergency shelter system the way I've seen it and the way it's set up right now. Like, what would that look like? How could you? It would just be difficult. But beyond that, I just want to say also that I find this whole everything that you've presented to be so alarming and heartfelt, and just knowing how the condition that people are in when they enter into the shelter system in particular. People are just everyone is just, they're traumatized, they're, in crises. And this is just very, very difficult. And especially when you have your intake discussion, and if you're trying to self-identify, they're asking all these personal questions. It's hard and it's impossible um, in a lot of ways when you're sitting there and they want to know who you are and what qualifies you as being homeless and how you identify and all these different things. It's just almost impossible. So
Yeah,
I just find this whole discussion so pertinent, and the underlying issues are just alarming across the board. And I'm just grateful that we're discussing it today. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Teresa. I think the issue, the reality, just say the reality that everybody who experiences homelessness has been subjected to levels of trauma that are beyond what any human should sustain. And it gets worse for women. It gets worse for queer and trans folks. It gets worse for Black folks. It gets worse for Latinx folks. Like, we know this, and there's a baseline. Like, everybody has horrible experiences. And so this position that providers are in is an incredible one. It is incredibly daunting to know how to address basic needs while also not just triggering and re-traumatizing right and left. So I appreciate the questions and the comments that are coming up today, because I hope what you're hearing and what I'm saying is, like, some things are baked, but there's a lot that is very complicated and real and needs to be worked out at each agency and with the COC and the agencies to figure out how to get there. So thank you. Now I'm going to do some skipping around in these slides, because how these are set up, I'll just say, because you're going to get the slides after. There are policy slides and there are practice slides. So I want to focus on the practice today, but just know that you're getting the policy slides as well.
Excuse me, Abby, Teresa, I see your hand up. I don't know if did it go up newly, or was it up before? Teresa?
Sorry, I just didn't figure out how to bring it
Oh,
down.
that's no problem. I just wanted to okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Liz. So, I mean, we'll do just a very slapdash here. This is nothing that I haven't already said. If we're talking about eligibility, you cannot use somebody's gender identity or expression or sexual orientation or family composition to render somebody ineligible for a project. And that includes if their anatomy doesn't match what you think a gender should be, if they have medical records, or if they look like that doesn't look like I would expect a woman to look or a man to look. None of that is relevant, is the long and the short of it. Now for intake and that moment, here it's a lot of the same stuff, which is why I'm not going to focus heavily here, but I think it's important to pull these out into eligibility and intake, because these are things that happen at different times. And so if there are different staff that it applies to, there needs to be language for each of those groups. But right, we're not asking, does your gender match your ID? You're not asking, have you had the surgery? What is your medical status? You're not asking about hormones, right? But that's like what you're not doing. What are you doing? When you are doing an inclusive intake, and let me just say, I'm using intake as a placeholder here. So maybe this doesn't happen at intake, depending on how your project is set up. But when you're having the conversation that Teresa was talking about with the HMIS elements, and you're asking all these questions, there are a set of things that are going to be really helpful to do with everyone at that point. Go through the agency policies with folks, and like, not every single one, but go through your non-discrimination policies for everyone. Because part of creating the environment that works for everyone well enough in these difficult environments that many of you operate is making sure that everybody knows what the standard of behavior is, right? Like, these are not things we do. Let people know from the get-go that they can request a reasonable accommodation. If you use participant agreements, review it, emphasize, like, this is our commitment to people. This is the commitment we're asking from you. Tell people of their right and the process to submit grievances. And tell people about their right and the process to file complaints. And those last two also have signage, because I mean, there's only so much that somebody can process, right, in that moment. But these are things that people should know from the get-go when they come in. And when you're asking specifically about gender, some things that can ease the process: lead with your own pronouns. That signals a level of understanding. And also ask people to define their gender themselves, if you can. If they're like, I don't even know what that means, great education moment. And the gender identity element is set up so that you can select all that apply, and HUD did that on purpose to be maximally inclusive. So at different points in my gender journey, I would say I would have selected woman and non-binary. Right now, I think I'd just select non-binary. I don't know if I would select transgender, but also I'm going to be looking at the other person who's asking me this question. And if they seem like they don't have a clue, I'm not telling them anything. I'm just going to say woman, right? Because I've determined that that's the placement that's going to be better for me. Or I might just say, I'm not answering that. But it really does come down to the trust and the safety that you can create in that moment for people. And part of that is also with name and pronouns. So the policy is pretty simple. You use the name and pronouns that a client uses, and you do it everywhere, always, whether it's in writing, out loud, in reference to, when speaking to. But the practice of it is more is where the quality comes. So when you are asking for name, unless you are VA funded, at this point, you can use preferred name in HMIS. That is a data standard change in 2024. Or 2023, right? Sorry, I'm getting my years mixed up, but whatever the most recent data standards are, you can use a preferred name in HMIS. Now, I know that that can create a lot of issues down the line, so you may decide, nope, we're still going to collect legal name and we're going to do actual, name that somebody uses. If you are asking for legal name, I would recommend a set of questions in a particular order. I would start with, hey, what's your name, or what do you go by? I would do not lead with legal name. What do you go by? That person tells you, next question, is that your legal name, or is your legal name different? And in that moment, observe. If you see any of the markers of trauma come up immediately, somebody gets smaller, they get quiet, they go ashen, they like get a wild look in their eye, right? We know what re-traumatization looks like, or at least staff should know what that looks like. If you get those cues, that is your signal that that legal name has a lot of trauma attached to it. And it doesn't even need to be just because somebody is trans. Like, there are all kinds of reasons why a legal name can be a source of trauma. But particularly for trans folks, it is such a trauma that it has a name. We call it dead naming, because that name has associated with it potentially violence, bullying, rejection, isolation, systematic microaggressions over the years. There are many things that have happened with that name, and it's also associated with a gender that that person has not identified with. And so there's a like leaving behind function. And so when we ask legal name, all of that can get queued up. So work with your staff to make sure that they're prepared in that moment to deal with it. And say, like, I can, maybe legal name is not something that you really want to say out loud. Like, can you write it down and just slide it over to me and I'll put it in here, and then we will make sure that we always call you your name, your actual name. Or maybe like, let's do a little exercise. Let's say it as softly as we possibly can, and then I will take it and I will write it and we will never say it again. Right? And maybe a little bit of aftercare there. And ask somebody's pronouns as well at that moment. If you can't record it in HMIS, like if there's not a pronoun line, put it in the case notes. And I'm not going to play that video, but I would love for you all to take a look at it. It is a lesson in what happens when you have staff who are not trained, not malevolent, just staff that aren't trained, and the types of things that happen and what it, like, you can feel what it feels like. So, sorry, I got lost in my own sauce. What was I going to say? Yes. So confidentiality and privacy, the policy, all clients have right to privacy, right? This is applying to their data as well as themselves. So the last line here is what I want to focus on. If necessary, staff can share the name and pronouns that a client uses to make sure that everybody else is using those to address that client. But how do you do that? You actually have a conversation with that client about sharing that information. And then that client will tell you whether they want it shared or not. So it could be that that person feels a connection with you because you're well trained, because you understand, but say, yeah, so I told you I use they, them pronouns, but I don't know that I can, I don't know that I'm ready to like go out with that to everyone else. So like, I know it seems counterintuitive, but could you just have people use my legal name and she, her, like, that's going to be better for me. That's an okay outcome. If that's how that person wants to proceed, then go with that. But talk about why and how sharing that information can improve somebody's experience, and then just listen to them and they will tell you what they need. We have not focused like as a field very much on privacy policies, informed consent, release of information. I feel like it's something that we set it and forget it. It may be 20 years since we've looked at it, at the privacy policy or at the informed consent language. This is a time to pull those out and take a look at what they are, because depending on what's happening in your state, recognizing that Connecticut is in a much better situation, but if there are genuine threats to people's information or to their personhood, via their information being subpoenaed or otherwise acquired by people who don't have their best interests in mind, that may be information that needs to be communicated. You may have a spike in your data, in your gender element of like fewer people identifying as trans or fewer people giving any gender. And that is an okay outcome because that is somebody making a decision about their safety in that moment. So being transparent about who will see the information is really big. Make sure that people walk away with a copy of the privacy notice and that it is written in plain language. The fact that we have AI to write things for us at different comprehension levels now is brilliant. Use it. get it to a 4th grade comprehension level, right? So that people can understand what's happening with their data. And this is back to the subpoena question earlier. Subpoenas are not, they are not like an automatic transaction. Like, oh my God, I get the subpoena, I have to respond tomorrow. No. The presence of a subpoena is a signal to call the lawyer and figure out what you need to do. There are different levels of subpoenas, depending on who issues it. It has different levels of strength behind it. And there are fights that you can enter into and ultimately arrive at, no, we're not giving that data. I think one of the things that happened with one of those earlier headlines that I was showing is Vanderbilt University Hospital was providing care to a lot of trans young people, and they just coughed up those records. Like, it looked like overnight. They were like, oh, okay. Maybe they were fighting it for a year or 2 years. I don't know. But those moments decimate people's trust in an institution. So this is a really important part of the protection of privacy and confidentiality. I think that's pretty much what I want to say there. There's a couple links here. Boston Healthcare for the Homeless has a really nice privacy policy that I would recommend taking a look at. So when we're talking about physical accommodations in the facilities, the policy, again, straightforward, based on your gender, like, you provide access to any gender segregated services or parts of the facility based on the gender that somebody provides. Knowing that if somebody is non-binary, right, sitting in the spectrum of gender, that you have the latitude to say what's going to work best for you. In practice, this is more complex. It's the social and cultural elements of your program that are speaking to people, that are indicating things to people when they walk through your doors. People are asking, can I be myself here? Am I going to have to hide? Am I going to have to give she, her pronouns and say, yes, call me Abilene, like that's all we're going with? Am I going to get beat up here? Am I going to get cornered in the bathroom? Do the staff seem to understand what I need? And all of it comes to this penultimate question: am I safe enough here to not be on the streets tonight, or not be in an already like really unsafe situation? And those answers have to be yes. We have to figure out how to get those answers to be yes. And if you have done that work, then you get to post materials that say, you are safe here. We welcome you here. If you haven't done the work, don't hang the signage. I think sometime in the last 5 years, I got a question from somebody that has always stuck in my head, where she said, what do I have to do to earn the privilege of putting up those posters? And I think that's the question to ask. And it's training. It's acculturation of staff, volunteers, and contractors. Anybody who somebody's coming in contact with. If a security guard is the first person who interacts with people as they're coming in, that security guard needs to be trained, needs to understand the behavioral expectations. So not leaving out any of the parties that are interacting with people. Now, reasonable accommodations, spend a little bit of time on. These are really important. The biggest thing that happens with reasonable accommodations that is problematic, and why HUD included the non-discriminatory steps to address privacy concerns, is that in a moment when, like Teresa's talking about, where it's a crush, like somebody is traumatized and somebody else is traumatized and things are just not going well, if person A comes to a staff person and says, I need person B out of my room, and the basis for it is that that person is trans or queer or non-binary, you cannot then turn the accommodation on person B. You've got to focus on person A. Like, if they're telling you, I need this person out of my space, what they're telling you is, I'm not okay. I need something. And I think a common mistake is to then focus on person B, right? Well, let's move them. No, stick with the person in front of you. What do you need to feel more comfortable? If that person comes to you saying, I'm person A, but I represent B through H, and we all feel this way about person Z, you are talking to one person. That person is not going to mobilize the shelter, right? Like everybody in a residence to speak on behalf of them. That person is asking for an accommodation so that they can feel more okay. So focus on that. I think this often comes up with showers, and it comes up with sleeping arrangements. So I have here a list of accommodations and physical improvements that you can make to navigate the situation that Teresa laid out so beautifully. That everybody's in their trauma, and you've got to figure out a way to make it work. Can you put latching or locking stall doors? They have special stall doors now for, like, if you're worried about people ODing in a bathroom, like make sure they open out and not in, right? That there is a way to like flip the latch from the outside if it's right in dire circumstances. If you have a single-use bathroom, that make it available upon request. If you can use any kind of room dividers, partition systems, to make things a little more visually private in the bathing areas, that's great. If you have done those things or if you haven't, regardless, those are just physical improvements that you can make. But there are also accommodations then that you can offer on a case-by-case basis. And the case-by-case is really important. Because if you say as an agency, we don't feel like we can keep trans people safe, and so when they come to us, we're just going to offer them a hotel motel voucher, that is an isolating and segregating act. That is a systematic policy that the agency is isolating people because of their trans status, which is discriminatory. So it can't be the only thing you offer. And it needs to be offered when somebody asks, not assuming that somebody just needs to go elsewhere. So you can offer alternate bathing times, you can offer alternate like bathroom use times for anyone, focusing on the person who has the issue and not the person they have the issue with. You can offer hotel and motel vouchers, of course. If you can do set aside on-site sleeping, that's great. If you can just make sure there are a couple beds close to night staff, like for safety concerns, these are tools in a toolbox. Just make sure your toolbox is not just hotel vouchers, because that ends up perpetuating a segregating function that you don't want to be involved in. For harassment and discrimination, again, this policy is going to be in that sample policy document that you get after this, but I want to focus on the poster on the left. So I said a couple slides ago, earn the privilege of hanging signs that say, hey, we are a welcoming space. This is one you don't need to earn any privilege for. This is saying, hey, HUD enforces regulations that make sure that this happens. This is actually a two-page poster. It's beautiful. It's ready for printing and posting. Get that up. Because the second page also tells people how to submit complaints to the Fair Housing Enforcement Office. In practice, oh my God, we're at 11:29. I'm so sorry, Liz.
No, I'm sorry, I was just private messaging you. I'm not-
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Well, I'm a little embarrassed.
No, I apologize. I should have given you a heads up sooner. I was listening and not watching
Hey,
the
I'm
clock.
just in
Sorry.
it, totally in it. For practicing anti-discrimination, I'm just gonna say participant agreements go a very long way. It is a document you can bring people back to in the moment of conflict, in the moment of person A complaining about person B, right? Can come back to that. But also building a culture in your facility of this, like, don't wait for Pride Month. Don't wait for Black History Month. Like, make it a space where people feel like, oh, I'm seen here. Now, given that we are at time and I have completely blown things, let me see. So there's a whole set of slides that are just like informational, right? I'm gonna touch on those very quickly. We've just got like terminology, and I'm just giving you some crib notes so that when you get these slides, you can take a look. All kinds of links to get more. There are training materials here. There are Connecticut specific support links here. How you can file a complaint. Get this slapped up on a wall somewhere. So those are the resources. The areas that I did not get to are about healthcare, reproductive health, medication. This is not rocket science here. Just the long and the short of all of this is don't make assumptions. Ask what somebody needs. The fact that gender and sex are not the same thing means that you don't know reproductive status. You don't know what somebody needs. You don't know if they need, right? There's just a lot that you don't know, and you don't need to know. Until somebody says, hey, can I have this referral, or you're giving referrals, or you're doing healthcare on site, and make sure that that folks are getting access to the full spectrum of referrals or healthcare provision that you have on site. And the same with medication. Make it the same. I think so I'm just gonna flip forward to my last slide so that I can just say a few more things. If you'll allow me to go a few minutes over, with my apologies. I hold the statement that Cecilia made in that video very strongly of a good experience is a seamless experience. I do not need to be draped in a trans flag as I walk through the door and celebrated. I just want to be treated as the person that I am. Listen to my needs. Listen to me telling you who I am, and let's act from that point. And I think there are obviously lots of permutations of policies and practices and all that, but that's what it comes down to. So, Liz, any closing?
No, just thank you for doing this. Lots of thank yous in the chats. And you're so great. You're so inspirational, as everyone's saying in here, Abby. And I love to do this and listen to you because I learned so much. And you're so good at this, Abby. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is really close to my heart, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending. Look out for slides and the recording, and please pass them along to staff, to anyone and everyone, please, because it's important information. Good
All
stuff.
right.
Stay cool. Be well. Thank you. Thank you.